Welcome to First Sleep Aid, calm stories to help you unwind, learn, and fall asleep. From true crime to curious facts and thoughtful ideas, always softly spoken. Subscribe now and take a deep breath. You're in good hands. Okay, so sometimes you stumble across these cases, right? And they feel like they're holding up a mirror, to
Mhm.
like how our society actually works,
Yeah,
the legal system, the media, even like our own assumptions about things.
definitely.
And the case of Jörg Kachelmann, the weatherman, the well-known weather presenter, this is like one of those for me.
It is. It is.
This case is one of those cases.
It really brings up so many different issues that are still relevant today. It started with his arrest at the Frankfurt airport in March of 2010. And it was all based on this rape accusation, right,
Right.
from a former partner. But I think that what happened was this case quickly expanded beyond just a typical criminal investigation.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you're looking at all these complexities around violence against women, right? And how the media reports on accusations before there's any legal findings or anything like that. And then you've also got the issue of false accusations, right?
All right.
Which is incredibly sensitive and super serious. So it's like all these huge societal themes are intersecting in this one case.
Yeah, and it's interesting, too, because Kachelman was not some random guy.
Right.
I mean, he's a Swiss citizen, but he'd been like a very well-known figure on German television
Mm.
for years and years,
Mhm.
known for being really articulate and really charismatic, the head of his own meteorology company, Media.
Ah.
So, he's already in the public eye. But the interesting thing is that, like, most accounts say that his private life before all of this was pretty discreet.
Yeah, before all this went down.
Right. Yeah, it's pretty crowded. Then you've got this, like, dramatic arrest. Right
Huh.
after he gets off a flight from Canada. And the allegations that his former partner was making were, they were really disturbing. I mean, she's talking about violence, threats with a knife, this supposed act of just like brutal dominance in his apartment in Schwetzingen. It's so different from the public persona of like the weatherman that everybody knows. It is. And it's like, it was shocking to a lot of people. And for this deep dive, we want to look at two main areas. So first, we're going to look at the legal process,
Yeah.
the investigation, the trial, all of that. And then we also want to look at the media portrayal of this case, how society reacted to it and how this all ties into the bigger issue of violence against women.
Okay, so let's start with the legal stuff first.
Okay.
So he gets arrested on March 9th, 2010, based on this accusation of rape that supposedly happened in Schwetzingen. So what happened right after he was detained? What were like the immediate next steps?
So right after the arrest, he was put in custody, and this started this whole period of pretrial detention that lasted over 4 months. And they were basically saying that they were holding him because there was urgent suspicion
Hmm.
because of the accusation, but also because there was a risk of flight. I mean, he traveled internationally a lot.
Right.
So this pretrial detention was really long, and I think it shows just how seriously they were taking these accusations from the beginning.
Yeah. I mean, over 4 months, that's a long time,
It is.
especially when there hasn't even been a conviction yet. So that really emphasizes how seriously the courts were considering the accusations. But, as the investigation went on, it seemed like things got a little murkier, right?
Exactly. As they started digging into the evidence, investigators started to find some inconsistencies and some questions about how reliable the accusations were.
Okay.
And this is where some of the really important aspects of the trial come in.
So, like the medical reports, I remember those being in the news a lot at the time.
Yeah. So they presented the medical records as evidence. They showed that she had bruises. But here's the key. The forensic report couldn't definitively say that her injuries were directly because of what she said happened. They couldn't rule it out, but
Yeah.
they couldn't confirm it either.
Got it.
And that was a really big point of disagreement during the trial.
Okay, so it wasn't as straightforward as some of the media reports maybe made it seem at the time.
Right.
What about the psychological evaluation of the accuser? That was also part of the case, wasn't it?
Yeah. So first, the psychological evaluation said she was credible. But during the trial, they started to question that. They started to really look at that.
Really?
And the defense, they pointed out inconsistencies in her story. And there were even times when they could prove that what she was saying was false based on other evidence.
Oh, wow.
And so, all this made people question that initial evaluation of her credibility.
Yeah, for sure. And then you've got the whole thing with the digital evidence. I mean, that seems to be more and more important in a lot of cases these days.
It really does.
So what about things like phone records and online activity? Like, how did that stuff play into the Kachelmann trial?
Well, they looked at phone records, calendar entries, his travel records,
Yeah.
and they found inconsistencies in her story, like the timeline she gave and specific details she gave. And this really challenged her version of what happened, like what happened before and after the alleged rape. And this became a really important part of the defense's case.
It sounds like the courtroom basically became this battle of different stories,
It totally did.
with the defense and the prosecution basically looking at the same facts and interpreting them totally differently.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Exactly. The defense was really focused on discrediting her. At one point, they even said that the prosecution was staging things. They were saying that they were messing with the evidence.
Wow.
But then the prosecution was like, no, the defense is trying to destroy the witness.
Right.
They're trying to make her look bad so that no one believes her.
So you've got these two completely opposing strategies.
Totally. And this whole thing, this back and forth, it went on for 44 days in the Mannheim Regional Court.
44 days. That's a lot of time.
Yeah, it was a long trial. And then finally, in May 2011, they came to a verdict. They acquitted him. But the reason they acquitted him, that's really important. So they acquitted him based on this legal principle. It's Latin. It's in dubio pro reo. And that basically means, when in doubt for the accused.
Right.
Or in simpler terms, it's the benefit of the doubt.
Okay.
And they basically said they didn't have enough evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he was guilty. But, and this is so important, they did not say he was innocent.
Right. I think that's such an important point because legally it just means that they didn't have enough to convict him.
Yeah,
But, in the public's mind, an acquittal doesn't always mean someone's innocent.
that's right.
Right. So it kind of leaves this ambiguity, this question mark.
It does.
Why do you think that's so hard for people to understand?
I think it's because we want answers,
Yeah.
especially in cases like this. We want to know for sure what happened. But the legal system, it's not always about finding the absolute truth.
Right.
It's about being fair.
Yeah.
Beyond a reasonable doubt, that standard, is because we know that we can't always know everything for sure in court. And in dubio pro reo, that's there to protect people from being wrongly convicted, which is so important for a fair system.
Yeah.
But it doesn't always give us the neat and tidy answer that we're looking for.
Right.
And in Kachelmann's case, because they didn't say he was innocent, there was still room for people to doubt and speculate.
Yeah, totally. So let's talk about the media and how all this played out in society. It was a huge story, right? I mean, it was everywhere.
Oh, yeah. It was everywhere. I mean, as soon as he was arrested, it was all over the news. Everyone was talking about it.
And it seemed like there were so many different ways the media was covering it.
Yeah.
Some were really sensational and some were more careful.
Yeah, absolutely. The tabloids, they went all in on the gossip.
Yeah.
They were digging up all sorts of personal stuff about him. And then you had these more mainstream outlets, but some of them, they were already taking sides.
Oh, really?
Even before the trial even started. Like
Yeah.
they were saying she was the victim and he was guilty. It was almost like a trial by media.
Yeah. But I mean, thankfully, there were some people who were saying, hold on, we need to let the legal process play out.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. There were some journalists and some legal experts who were really worried about that, about the media making up its mind before all the facts were out.
Yeah.
They were saying, hey, he's innocent until proven guilty. And they were also asking some important questions about how the media should be reporting on cases like this.
Yeah.
Where's the line between freedom of the press and being responsible?
Right.
Because when you're dealing with something as sensitive as this, it's really important to be careful.
Absolutely. And Kachelmann himself, he talked about how it was like being in a media war. He even wrote a book about it where he basically accused some journalists of being really unfair and trying to damage his reputation. What do you think that says about how powerful the media can be, especially when it comes to something like a criminal trial?
I think it shows just how much influence the media has.
Yeah.
They can shape how the public sees things, especially in big cases like this. The Kachelmann case, it's a reminder that journalists have a huge responsibility to report things accurately and fairly.
Yeah.
Because if they don't, it can actually impact the legal process.
Yeah.
People might already have decided someone's guilty just because of what they've seen in the media.
Right. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about violence against women. That's such a huge issue, and this case really brought it to the forefront.
It did.
How do you see those two things connected?
That was a really difficult part of this whole thing. Because he was acquitted, There were a lot of people, especially women's rights groups and advocates for victims,
Yeah.
who were really worried.
Yeah.
They were afraid that this case, because it was so public, would discourage other women from coming forward if they'd been assaulted.
Right.
They were worried that women would be scared that no one would believe them.
That makes sense. I mean, sexual violence is already so underreported. And even when women do report it, it's not always easy to get a conviction.
Exactly. And then there's the stigma, the shame that society often puts on victims. So anything that makes it even harder for them to come forward is a huge problem.
Absolutely. But then there's the other side of that.
Yeah.
The fact that sometimes people do make false accusations.
Right.
And those can be just as devastating, even if there's no conviction.
Yeah, you're right. And the Kachelmann case, it's a really clear example of how much damage a false accusation can do. It can ruin someone's life, their reputation, everything.
Yeah. So we've got this really tricky balance to figure out as a society.
They do.
How do we support victims and make sure they feel safe to come forward while also protecting people from being falsely accused?
It's a hard question.
Hmm.
It's a really hard question. And it's something we need to keep talking about, especially when we're dealing with cases that are this public and this emotional.
For sure. So what happened to Kachelmann after all this? I mean, he was acquitted, but it doesn't sound like things just went back to normal for him.
No, not really. Even though he was cleared legally, there was still this kind of cloud hanging over him. Like people still had doubts.
Yeah.
It's what they call stigmatized exoneration.
Yeah.
It's like this stain that's hard to get rid of. Even if you're innocent, the accusation itself can still hurt you.
Wow. What about the woman who accused him? What happened to her?
Well, it's interesting. Even though there were all these questions about her story, and even though it seemed like she might have lied, she was never actually charged with perjury.
Uh-huh.
They decided not to go forward with that.
Okay. And what about Kachelmann? Did he just try to move on?
No, he didn't. He was really vocal after the trial. He did interviews. He wrote his book. He really wanted to set the record straight. He felt like he'd been portrayed unfairly, and he wanted to clear his name. And because of all that, he's become kind of a symbol, a controversial one, in this whole debate about false accusations and how much power they have.
Yeah, it's crazy how one case can have so many layers and affect so many different things.
It is.
It really makes you think. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Jörg Kachelmann case, it's clear that there are no easy answers. I mean, there's a legal verdict, but it doesn't feel like there's a clear sense of justice for everyone involved.
No, it doesn't. I think this case shows us that sometimes the legal system, it can't solve everything.
Right.
There are these human and social aspects that are just really hard to address in a courtroom.
So what are some of the key takeaways from all of this? Like, what do you hope people will remember from this case?
I think the biggest thing is just how important it is to have thorough investigations.
Yeah.
To really look at the evidence carefully and to not jump to conclusions. We have to let the legal process do its job. And the media, they have a huge role to play in that. They need to be careful about how they report on these kinds of cases. They can't be trying to influence the outcome.
Right.
And then there's the bigger picture, the societal question.
Yeah.
How do we support victims of sexual violence while also protecting people from false accusations? It's a really difficult balance to find.
Yeah, it is. I mean, this case, it really highlights the fact that the truth isn't always black and white, right?
Right.
And the legal system has to work within that gray area. It makes you think about how important it is to protect the rights of the accused, but also to support victims. It's a lot to think about.
It is, actually.
Especially when you consider how much the media can influence things.
Definitely. It's a lot to consider.
Thanks for breaking it all down.
You're welcome. It's been a really interesting discussion.
For sure. I think this is a case that's going to stick with me for a while.
Me too.
It really makes you question a lot of things.
It does.
And I hope it's made our listeners think too.
I hope so too. It's important to have these conversations.